Hello, everybody, and welcome to KGS Music Appreciation. Here we are finally this week with Sonata-Allegro form. We've been kind of setting this up for the past couple of weeks. We started with a little bit of harmony and what is tonality. And we moved on to, of course, what is musical form as a whole. We talked specifically about a couple of forms last week, which are the precursors to this form. So yeah, it kind of all added up to this so far. So without further ado, here we go. Sonata-Allegro form. Okay, so I always like to start off with a little bit of context first. So Sonata-Allegro form, as we talked about last week, is a fusion of some of the elements from binary and ternary forms. And we'll get into exactly how and what in just a moment. So it's usually found in first movements of compositions, though not exclusively. So there's no law, of course, that it has to be the first movement. Let's just say that there's a higher probability that the first movement of a symphony, a concerto, a piano sonata will use this form. Now, the basic form begins to appear roughly around the 1740s or so in Italy. There's no official date that we can give to say on this date it was invented by this composer in so and so place. That's just not how these things work. Forms kind of develop from one another. It's a very fluid process, and we can't give an exact date for any of these things. What we can say, though, is in Italy, around this time, some compositions start to use this form a little more regularly. And it becomes a thing at that point. It becomes a thing that spreads to Germany, to Central Europe, kind of like a musical virus, if you will. And throughout the rest of the 18th century, it is fully established and fully developed as, let's say, the premier form of a musical narrative. And when I say the premier form of musical narrative, I usually refer to the works of these three titanic individuals of the classical period: Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. When we talk about Sonata-Allegro form at its height, at its most mature, at its most beautiful and developed in the classical period specifically, which is between those dates that I wrote over there, we refer to these three guys. That's not to say that, of course, there were no other composers. There were many other composers that used this form. There were many other composers that did it incredibly well with incredible results. We just happen to have attached ourselves, I guess, to these three guys because we love their music the most. We perform it the most, and we study it the most as a result. So they kind of set the bar in the classical period for what Sonata-Allegro form will be in the successive 200 years. Okay, one last note here. Why is it called Sonata-Allegro form? What on earth do those two terms actually imply? So the first thing to know is these terms are used after the fact. It's composers from the 18th century didn't open up an encyclopedia of forms, look up this thing, Sonata-Allegro form, and just write in that form because it was already established. First, compositions were written, and then later on, musicologists came along and tried to classify these forms into something comprehensive. And that's where Sonata-Allegro form was essentially introduced in the 19th century to explain the works of the 18th century. So what do they mean? Sonata specifically means something that is played on an instrument, as opposed to a cantata, which is sung by a voice. So this form, more often than not, is going to apply to instrumental works, which don't have a musical narrative of their own through words, like a cantata does, or an opera does. So it's going to apply for the most part to instrumental works. That's why the term sonata is even in there. Now, the second term, allegro, is an Italian term that means brisk. Now, the first movements of instrumental compositions, more often than not, are going to be at a brisk, upbeat tempo. That's why they usually contain the term allegro in them. And that's why the term allegro is kind of taped onto this form, because it's more often than not going to be used in a first movement of an instrumental composition. It's not meant to explain anything more than that. Again, it's like I said, just a way for musicologists, when they study these works, to classify a whole chunk of compositional techniques into one comprehensive whole that can be taught, that can be explained. So here we go. All right, so you've probably noticed by now that when I introduce anything, in this case a form, I need to establish a little bit of terminology first. These terms, motif, theme, harmony, melody, these are terms that I casually throw around at this point because they become such an ingrained part of my vocabulary. But they're by no means self-explanatory, and they do need to be explained to a certain degree to understand how and why they apply to larger concepts. So these terms, motif and theme. The hard part about describing what these things mean is that words do not do them justice. Let's say they don't really, you can't verbally explain what a motif is and expect that the listener is going to have a concrete idea of the parameters of what's being done here. So let's just put it this way. First, I'm going to talk about it, and then I'm going to give an example. So, in terms of a conceptual definition, motif is a condensed germinal musical idea that can serve as the basis for a theme or stand on its own in a musical composition. So the most famous motif of all time is this repeated note figure that just reappears in the entire first movement and the entire symphony, actually, in all kinds of ways. So it's the most germinal musical cell, the most germinal, let's say, cell of musical content that can develop into something more depending on how it's used. In this case specifically, it's used like this. At this point, it starts to become a theme. So it's no longer just one small germinal idea. It's now a more comprehensive, developed musical idea, which in this case, this theme, happens to be based on a motif, on that first motif that we just played. There's no law, of course, that says it has to be. There are other themes, like that, of course, are not based on a motif at all, but they are their own musical line that makes sense on its own, has a comprehensive contour of its own. Now, having defined all of these in some basic way, you have to remember, these are not absolute things. There's no objective thing that is a motif. There's no objective thing that is a theme. People can and often do disagree on what constitutes a theme. Is this an actual theme, or is it somehow a subdivision of a theme? Is it a commentary on a theme? Can it be counted as an actual theme or actual motif itself? These are musical discussions that go on about compositions for years. So the most important thing is, although there is a ballpark idea of what a motif and a theme is or are, it's up to the listener. You get to essentially decide what constitutes a theme, what constitutes a motif. And you always have to remember, just like with form, these terms are not invented, but they are applied after the fact to compositions that came before. So these terms are musicological ex post facto, to use some Latin in there, ex post facto descriptions of what composers had done prior. Okay, two more terms that are maybe a little bit easier to pin down, let's say, than the previous two are melody and harmony. So to start with harmony, because that's probably the more objective of the two, harmony is a number of things, but it is a synonym for a chord. So pitches that are simultaneously played. That is a C major harmony. That doesn't mean that the pitches need to be simultaneously played to be a harmony. That just means they're a chord. They can also be played. It's still a C major harmony, though. That's the point. Melody is a musical line of successive pitches that stands out above the rest of the texture. This is a little bit more kind of like the previous terms. There's no real objective thing that is defined as a melody, but you know it when you hear it. So if I ask you, for example, to sing back to me your favorite song, whatever song that would be, what you sing back to me is most likely going to be the melody. It is the most, let's say, the premier line of that piece, the thing that stands out the most. That doesn't mean it's the most important, but it's the one that you recall the first, like the painting, let's say, and the framework is everything else. So with this piece over here, the melody is the right-hand line, this. The harmony in this case is what I played with the left hand. If I'd played these harmonies as chords, it'd be... Okay, so that's the basic idea. If you take these elements and you play them individually, they're not very interesting. A melody stands out, but if you play on its own, it has no foundation. It has no framework to kind of shine through. There's no clashes of intervals to make a melody interesting. You need a harmonic framework underneath to give that melody some kind of character. And likewise, if you just play a harmony underneath on its own, you'll get a collection of pitches together, but they don't have any kind of interesting direction. They don't have any kind of contour. They're there to hold something else up. So both of these elements are incredibly important, but they're much more interesting and much more beautiful when you put them together. Okay, so scale degrees and key areas is a topic that I'm going to be returning to a lot, as you've noticed in the past two videos. It's crucial to harmony, it's crucial to tonality. So from last presentation, we talked again about the essence of tonality is to establish a tonic key, to depart from that key to a related key area, most likely the dominant, because that's a strong relationship, and to come back to the tonic key. That doesn't mean that that's the only possible key area that a composer can go to within a tonal system. There are many key areas, and that's what makes music interesting, all these possibilities. Well, today I want to talk about two other possibilities, really one possibility with two, let's say, variations of it, which is this idea of relative major and minor. Now, in a major scale, let's say again C major, if you start playing the scale not from the first pitch, not from the tonic, but from the sixth scale degree, from the sub-mediant, so from here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you start the C major scale, the exact same notes from this pitch, you get this. You have a minor scale. So major and minor scales are very closely tied. Each major scale has a relative minor scale, which means that it consists of the exact same notes, only started from a different pitch. In this case, from major, you have to start on the sixth scale degree, the submediant, and you get the relative minor. From a minor scale, you have to start from the third scale degree, the mediant, and you get the relative major scale. The exact same notes, from starting from a different pitch within that scale. So obviously, these have strong relationships, just like the dominant does. And since the pitches themselves have strong relationships, the key areas are going to have incredibly strong relationships. So a piece that we're about to hear is going to start in the key of G minor. When it changes key, it's not going to go to the dominant. In this case, the composer decided to move it to the relative major. So from G minor, we got to the relative major of G minor, B flat major. Again, just another key area that has an incredibly strong tie to your tonic. He could have gone to the dominant. He could have gone to the subdominant. In this case, usually when you start in a minor key, it's very common to go to the relative major. When you start in a major key, composers more often than not will do something like go to the dominant or the subdominant. Once in a while, they will go to the relative minor. There's no reason why they can't, and they often do. But yeah, I just want to expand your harmonic vocabulary here because, like I said, it is the absolute linchpin of the entire tonal system. It is the most crucial aspect that drives tonality as a whole. All right, so let's get into it then. What exactly is Sonata-Allegro form? So at the highest level, it is a fusion of ternary and binary forms. In the ternary sense, the larger frame here is A, B, A. There's an A section, there's a contrasting B section, and there's a return of the A section material with some variations. Now, the binary aspect is that there is a much stronger relationship in terms of content between the A section and the B section. In ternary form, you remember, the A section and B section could, of course, were tied with some content. They had something to do with each other, but it was a marked contrast between those two sections. In binary form, it's much more thematically, motivically, harmonically related. You can tell that the B section flows from the A section. It's an expansion of what you heard in the A section. Well, putting all these ideas together, that's what Sonata-Allegro form is. So the A section is called the exposition. Here, your theme, your themes, which we'll get to in a moment, are introduced. And your key is established. You know what your tonic is, and you know where you're going from there. That's what the exposition is. Your B section is now called the development. So this is essentially a free-for-all. There's no prescribed sub-form for a development. It's just any idea, any musical content from the exposition, anything motivic, anything thematic, anything you can possibly think of, is now has the potential to be developed in interesting and creative ways by the composer. This is where the real imagination of this piece works, in this section. And then the return of the A section, now called A prime, is the recapitulation, which quite literally means to start from the beginning. So here the exposition is recapitulated. You can say literally, not often. There's always some kind of a variation, and we're going to get into why later. But this is the overall form of Sonata-Allegro. All right, so to begin with the exposition then. Like we said, the function of the exposition is to introduce you to your musical content, whether that be themes, whether it's motifs, anything in between. So the three most important pillars, the three building blocks of the exposition are theme A, theme B, and the codetta, which quite literally means the small tail at the end, the concluding material. So how it works 90% of the time. Theme A is introduced in your tonic key. That's how you know what is the most important key of your entire piece. That's what key the piece is in. That's where everything departs from. When you arrive at theme B, you're going to be, more often than not, in a new key area, a related key area to your tonic. That could be the dominant, the relative major, relative minor, all kinds of possibilities there. The more important thing about theme B is that it gives contrast to theme A in character, not just harmonically. So if theme A is, let's say, more jaunty, more happy-go-lucky, theme B is probably going to be, let's say, more slow, more pensive, more calm. It's going to give some kind of contrast in character to what you heard in theme A, not just in terms of the harmonies being used. And finally, the third section, or the third pillar, let's say, is the codetta, which more often than not will remain in the key area of theme B. And its function is to round out the entire exposition with some sense of finality. In between all of these pillars here, you have transitions. So just like in real life, a transition gets you from point A to point B. In this case, a transition gets you from theme A to theme B, or theme B to the codetta. That's the point of a transition. What a composer decides to do within that transition is a lot more free. It can be brand new material. It can be thematic material from theme A, thematic material from theme B, maybe a little bit of both, maybe something motivic, or all kinds of possibilities are open here. But the function of the transition is simply to get you from one point to another, and to get you to the let's say the final closing section of the codetta. All right, so I thought I'd do something a little bit differently this time. Instead of playing an audio clip and talking above it, which I think is a little distracting, what I'm going to do here is play a video clip of the first movement of Mozart's G minor symphony, a very well-known piece. And I made some annotations at the very bottom with what is theme A, what is theme B, what is the codetta, what are the transitions. So that way you can hear the entire exposition and just see along the way where things kind of develop. And you'll notice here the first movement here is called molto allegro. That's that allegro term we talked about again. It's at a very brisk tempo. So here we go. I'm going to play the clip and we'll talk about it after. Okay, wonderful piece, as you can hear. So you heard theme A was very agitated. It's in the tonic key of G minor. Incredibly agitated theme, a little bit violent also. The transitional material, harmonically, it started in G minor. It moved slowly until it got to the relative major, to B flat major. And theme B came in B flat major. It was more calm, it was more peaceful, contrasting character to theme A. From there, another transition. This one stayed in the key of B flat major till you got to the concluding material that reinforced B flat major. And at the end of the exposition, it's usually repeated again, especially if it's short. Like in this case, that wasn't terribly long. So you hear the entire thing twice. That's usually how an exposition works. All right, so here's where the fun really begins in a Sonata-Allegro form. So now that we have our musical content, we have our themes, we have our transitions, we have enough content to really work. A development takes all of your content that you have so far from the exposition and develops it in any conceivable way that the composer wants. So this is where the composer can really run wild with new key areas that have nothing to do with the original tonic. Maybe they're related, maybe they're not. Anything is fair game, anything thematic, anything motivic, anything orchestrational, different tempi, different characters all together. Everything is fair game in a development. And as you can tell, this is where a lot of the creative work of the piece really happens. One general characteristic, though, that you do have in a development, more often than not, is you don't have a clear sense of harmonic stability. You're not going to most likely find a key area for sure where you've established that key. The point of a development is to take you through all kinds of possible ideas without establishing one central idea at all. So that's one general characteristic. Another one, and you may or may not get this, it's not always the case, but at the end of a development, you could get what's called a retransition. So just like a transition takes you from point A to point B, a retransition brings you back from wherever you are to your original content. As we said, that's the entire idea of a tonal system. That's the entire idea of Sonata-Allegro form, which is start with content, depart from that content, return to it again, harmonically, formally, what have you. That is what a retransition will do, and we actually have one in this piece. So let's hear now the development of the Mozart G minor symphony, first movement. Okay, so you heard how a development works. All kinds of harmonic ideas. There's no real key area. All kinds of thematic and motivic combinations of what you heard from the exposition. All those ideas just kind of melded together in imaginative ways to give you the feeling of departing very far away sometimes from your home area. That's the idea of a development, to kind of depart you so you have somewhere to return from. And that's what you heard at the end of the development, a retransition, which is intended to take you back to your home key of G minor. And what's the best way to do that? With the dominant of G minor, which is what Mozart does. He plays the dominant chord for a certain number of bars, and he just goes immediately back into G minor for the recapitulation. So what is the recapitulation now? It is essentially a restatement of the form from the exposition. You start with theme A, just like any exposition, in your home key of G minor. From there, you go into a transition, just like you did before. And that transition is intended to take you to theme B. The difference now is that theme B in the recapitulation is in your tonic key. So if you'll remember in the exposition, theme B there was in a related key, maybe the dominant, maybe the relative minor, what have you. Here, it has to be in your tonic key. Now you're reinforcing the tonic key in every possible way. And from there, again, another transition to take you to the codetta. In this case, though, the transition to get to the codetta, which is again going to be in your tonic key, because that's the ending now of the entire piece, not just of the section. The transition in this case has to be heavily reworked. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. The transitions in a recapitulation cannot be identical to the transitions in the exposition, because the transition in the exposition take you to a new key area. So if you repeat them in the recapitulation, you're just going to go back to those new key areas, which you don't want to do. You want to rework those transitions so that you return to home keys in all of the three pillars. Well, sometimes those transitions require a lot of reworking, heavy reworking, let's say. So when that happens, it's sometimes referred to as a secondary development. It's an interesting little term. You don't really have to remember it. It's possibly the case. What you're going to hear in this case with in this Mozart example from the second theme, I consider it a secondary development going into the codetta. It's pretty heavily reworked transition from what you get in the exposition. And then of course this all leads to the codetta again. This time obviously it has to be in your tonic because everything is going to end at this point. And in this case, in this Mozart example, it'll be a somewhat more expanded version of the codetta because it's the ending of the entire piece now, not just the exposition. So he adds some more interesting material at the end. That is, again, a prerogative of the composer in the recapitulation. There's no law that says you have to repeat everything verbatim. All kinds of expansions and reworkings and remodelings are possible in a recapitulation. This is just the most skeletal, basic structure. Obviously, composers are going to go in all kinds of directions. So let's hear the recapitulation. Okay, so I think a recapitulation was pretty self-explanatory from my annotations. Two more things that I'd like to briefly touch on here are this idea of introduction and coda. So, Sonata-Allegro form is what we've talked about so far. That's the enclosed form in itself, from exposition all the way to the end of a recapitulation. What you'll often find in the first movement of a composition, though, is these two things, introduction and coda, framing the Sonata-Allegro form. So introduction, followed by Sonata-Allegro form, followed by a coda at the end. The introduction is kind of a freer thing. It doesn't have to relate in content to what happens after it. It can be its own unique character that kind of sets the stage. And then the Sonata-Allegro takes us to a brand new set of characters that may or may not be related. So this one's kind of an interesting addition, but you'll often see that in the works of Franz Joseph Haydn, for example, loves introductions. We didn't hear an introduction in this Mozart example, but you will hear it pretty often, I would say. A coda, on the other hand, is obviously the ending. So a codetta was the small tail. The coda is an expanded codetta, so a larger final conclusion to the entire piece, not just to one section of the piece. And we also didn't have a coda in this Mozart example, but he has written pieces with both an introduction and a coda. These things start to get developed a lot more in the 19th century. You get a lot more of it even with Beethoven, a little bit after Mozart, which is, composers can't keep doing the exact same thing over and over again. They want to expand on what they're given. So this form throughout the 19th century going into the 20th becomes incredibly expansive. When you get to the Mahler symphonies, for example, introductions are their own universes. They come back within Sonata-Allegro form. They're reworked within the coda. I mean, all kinds of combinations are now possible. But let's say in a more encased nutshell here, that is what Sonata-Allegro form is at its core. It will develop in all kinds of interesting ways, and it will definitely set the tone for musical narrative for roughly the next 200 to 300 years. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and happy listening.